Brilliant. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is a long day and a warm, lovely day in a place where I was, and as soon as I walked in, I said to the very kind people at the reception that it must be so annoying, so many people said to you as they walk in. The last time I was here, I did my finals. and I just sort of want to say that it is one of those places that everybody thought, oh, exams, you know, oops. Now, what excited me about today, though, is that I'm moderating a topic that I genuinely know very little about, other than what is in the news and what basically my crash course from this excellent panel the last couple of days, helping me prep. But the reason why I'm here, though, is because I have been in many conversations about food system transformation, the interface between health, environment, etc., you know, all the way from air pollution to obviously nutrition, and now to what is a medicalization of an issue that turned out to be potentially an interesting development on the food system. So, you know, for me, what is interesting and what is excellent about this topic is that it is a little bit out of my comfort zone. So join me in that, and maybe all of you are actual experts. But when we're talking about how all of us have a couple of friends going up to you sheepishly the last couple of months, saying, guess what, I've been on the fat jab, you know? And some of them call it something different, but nonetheless, the point is that it is becoming a lot more, and what they tell you is in the weight loss is about how everything else got better, is that many of them got in because of diabetes, of heart issues, etc. So my interests have been piqued. Today we have an excellent panel with us, and the format right now is that they're going to introduce themselves and then go into their introduction, and together the five of them will lay out the sort of landscape in terms of where we are when it comes to GLP-1 receptors, agonist receptors. And you see my language is not even right enough, and I'm not going to apologize for it because that would take all day if I do. But right now I'm assuming that we all want to find out more about the topic. So what we have today to start us with is Ben Yo, who will actually lay the ground for us in terms of the big picture. And then after that, we'll go to Archie. Yeah. I told you that I can't see this, right? Yeah. Then we'll have Jean, and then we'll have Dimitrios, and then we'll have Stephanie Walton. Now, all of them, we will end up with a Nobel Prize winner, future Nobel Prize winner, hopefully at the end. So this is what I'm promising you, is that they will give you a tour of what the key issues are. And then we'll come to some questions, and we have some questions we have as well. But also, as soon as anyone is interested, do show your hand so that I can bring you in as well as soon as we can. So with that, my name is Bernice Lee. I should have introduced myself, I just realized. I'm a distinguished fellow at Chatham House, which is an international affairs think tank, which has actually done a lot of work around food systems transformation over many years from different angles. So very proudly, I'm moderating this session. And Ben, may I pass to you? I believe you're one of our associate fellows as well.
Yes, I am, of the Sustainability Accelerator. So I'm Ben Yo. I'm an investor at RBC Global Asset Management. I help look after 30 billion steward of other people's assets around that, looking at global equities. I have a lens around sustainability and healthcare. I also do podcasting and playwriting and a lot of other interesting things on the side. I first came across GLP-1s, which are glucagon-like polypeptides, in the other place, actually, in Cambridge University in the late 1990s, as I was studying physiology. So GLP-1s had been around long enough that it had reached university courses. So that was the first time we'd done that, thinking about how diabetes and the physiology of that worked. Fast forward to 2005, when I was a healthcare investor, and actually the first ever GLP-1 agonist, as we call them, and now just think of them at GLP-1, so we don't put the science in them, had actually been released to the market. The brand name was Byetta. It was actually based, I don't know if you know the story of this, on saliva, which comes from the Gila monster, which is a lizard. So that was actually one of the roots of discovering this molecule. So GLP-1s have actually been around, and in humans, particularly in diabetes, for over 20 years now, and have been studied for quite a long time, roots of it in the 1980s. Fast forward today, we now have several generations of GLP-1s out in the market, and we can see that they're effective for weight loss. You're losing perhaps between 15 to 25% of your weight, and they seem to be working in a lot of these adjacent other areas as well. So that would be fatty liver, kidney disease, sleep apnea, maybe they're working in addiction and all of these other things. And that's because we kind of think that there's 3 scientific mechanisms of actions which are happening, not just weight-mediated, but 2 other pathways, which I'll broadly call anti-inflammatory and also anti-diabetic. So there's a kind of anti-weight, there's an inflammatory, and there's a diabetic pathway. And these seem to be having really broad-based effects across a number of phenomena. So where might we go in the future? If you look at that overall cluster of things that it might treat, or has actually already been shown to have efficacy, you're looking at what we call a TAM, a total addressable market, of in the order of about 1 billion people. You get there from obesity and diabetes relatively easily because, in terms of obesity, the US is over 30% obese. Obesity rates have gone up, although actually there's evidence that it might have peaked. So you've got very large numbers. And then once you put in things like sleep apnea, kidney, and things like that, and there's still some things that is being studied for. So there'll be a big study coming out later this year, which may or may not show some efficacy in dementia through an anti-inflammatory pathway. So you're talking about potentially very, very big numbers. Now, where we get to what number and in what year, we really don't know. So some people are saying, well, if you're going by 2030, maybe you'll be in 24 million Americans, maybe you'll be in 5% of the UK population, which is in the millions as well. And then if you think very long term, you could be talking hundreds of millions. So one of the things that you could look at is there's an anti-cholesterol drug today. This class is kind of called statins. About 1 in 10-ish people in the UK are on statins. And if you look at it worldwide, you're probably talking about 250 million to 300 million people on statins. So investors are kind of thinking baseline at some point, GLP-1s might be at the 250 to 300 million mark, and plausibly you could go further. That could take you 20 years, it could take you 30 years, it could take you 40 or 50 years. No one is absolutely sure. We'll talk about some of the caveats about why you want to reach there as well. One of the reasons that this might happen faster for statins than statins is statin acceleration really happened when statins went generic. So at the moment, most of this generation of GLP-1s are branded. They're still protected by patents. It basically means you can't get cheap copies of this drug, although first generations are going off patent. Those patents are actually disappearing for some of this generation. So the biggest one is Wegovy, which is the name of semaglutide. Its nickname is Sema. Sema is going generic in Canada next year, in Brazil next year as well, in the UK by 2031, we think. So genericization of this is happening faster. This will make it presumably very cheap, maybe cheap as generic statins, we don't know, and that will have an impact. The other thing we don't know is that oral versions of these kind of drugs are only kind of happening now. You actually do have an oral Sema, although it's quite hard to make. We've had late-stage results called phase 2 results from another oral GLP-1-like molecule from Lilly that has successfully read out this year. Most in the investment community think that's going to launch next year and the year after. And there's a huge debate as to what impact orals will have in the market, particularly for what we call maintenance. So, after you've been on the drug for a year or two, we'll talk about this later, people will go off the drug, gain back weight. Do you want to stick with an injection for maintenance for the rest of your life? A lot of people don't, question mark. So there's a really big debate on that. Having said that, those numbers are plausible. We might also pick up on some of the health economics, because also the health economics are really big. So direct cost in somewhere like the UK is maybe in the order of 10 billion pounds, 10 to 11 billion pounds. Once you add up the indirect costs for things like productivity and benefits and the stuff, you're talking about a figure of maybe 100 to 120 billion pounds. So if you make a really big dent on that, the health economics really work, particularly when you're generic, providing maintenance and all of these type of things. When you look at the US, those numbers are like crazily large, but seem to be plausible. You're talking about hundreds of billions. Some estimates are actually over the trillion because so much of their population are essentially chronic and can't get to work because of that. And similarly, then when you scale up to a global number, you're talking about really, really large numbers. And that isn't even within these second order effects about how is it impacting alcohol, how is it impacting food, how is it impacting addiction. So a lot of these things are coming up. So as an investor, we've actually already seen some of the impacts in other stocks and companies. One of the things around is the food and restaurants. We're maybe seeing some signs of reduced calorie consumption, different portion sizes, different mix, subtle shift in composition. You'll hear more of that from Archie. So this has broad implications in things like agriculture, labor and productivity. If you've turned from being out of work because you've got a chronic condition to being in work, a lot of these people are at working age, they're not retired. Healthcare budgets, you could say, is this something which could save the NHS in terms of like the amount of money that you could frame up? And then you've got these indirect pathway things on climate and other second order effects. We have some examples of this, but we're already seeing some evidence in the US that hip and knee replacements are coming in a little bit lower than we might have expected, because a lot of trouble and issues they get with your hip and knee are because you're overweight. And if your weight comes back to normal, you can live longer before you might need a hip and knee or something like that. So I'm going to conclude on my bit. These could have far-reaching effects. A lot is unknown, which is quite good because we can all be kind of speculative. A lot of the data will come back. There are a lot of caveats, and a lot of my peers on the panel will talk about these caveats. But plausibly, we're going to have a lot of people on these drugs or adjacent drugs. And plausibly, this is going to have a lot of first and second order effects across a number of sectors, across a number of consumer behaviors. And is kind of one of those things which is an unknown surprise, as in we probably know that we are going to be surprised by some things, but how we're going to be surprised, we're not quite sure. On that note, I'll hand over to Archie. No, Bernice, go.
No, brilliant. Thank you, Ben, for talking us through the body, first of all, but also the supply response, which you expect to be there, but also the demand side in many ways. So, obviously, we're now going through the different systems related reuse. Archie, you're going to tell us a bit more about what the first system's implication on you, but also the corporate view as well, given all these major changes that are coming down the line.
So Archie, I'm a partner at Bramble. We work with investors, entrepreneurs, policymakers to help accelerate the transition towards a better food system. So food is everything we do, and deep focus on the food system. On the back of, a lot of it's on the back of the work that Henry Dimbleby did in writing the National Food Strategy a few years ago. We, as we see it, at the moment, we think we're on a tipping point of really fundamental change across the food system, and particularly from a health perspective. There are 4 drivers, core macro drivers of that at the moment. These will probably evolve, and I'm sure there will be more in the future, but those 4 that most people are talking about at the moment, in no particular order. One is appetite suppressants, this topic, and I'll come back to that. Secondly is nutrition science and ultra-processed food. And again, nutrition science is really important there. I think our understanding of nutrition and the huge amount of research that's going on around the world at the moment, which is really critical to better understand, in particular, the mechanism behind ultra-processed food. It's another topic where there's a lot of opinion out there around whether we should or shouldn't be eating ultra-processed food. I think there's a relatively clear agreement on the causality of ultra-processed food and some, certainly people being overweight and some other diet-related ill health, but we really don't fundamentally understand the mechanism yet. And I think until we do, we won't see any sort of big moves from a policy or regulation perspective. AI, I'm not going to draw and go too deep on today, but like any other sector, we have to be thinking about the role that AI is going to play across the food system at the moment, and there are many, many, many different use cases. And then the final one is policy and regulation. And, I think I would love to see the food system change being driven entirely by consumers, but that's not going to be the case. And so there is a need for more policy and regulation. We have a government in the UK now, and in the US in a slightly different way, leaning into that very heavily. In the UK, I think in particular, that's the National Food Strategy was written by Henry and was an independent review. The previous government did actually do a few things behind the scenes, but didn't really pick it up in earnest. But this government has. They're very keen on it. You would have seen, no doubt, the 10-year NHS plan that was released a couple of weeks ago, which a large part of that focuses on ultimately prevention and as part of prevention, people being overweight and obese, and the food system linked to that. There's also now the government food strategy as well. So this government is leaning into this whole topic really quite substantively. And of course, there's a link there between the policy and regulation side of it and the appetite suppressant side as well. And the reason for that, and the reason this government is finally taking action on this whole topic, is because, one of the numbers that Ben referred to, there was a piece of work that was done a couple of years ago, commissioned by Jeremy Hunt when he was Chancellor, that really tried to understand the total economic cost of people being overweight and obese. And that was updated a couple of weeks ago and estimated at about £126 billion. So that's the direct cost of the NHS plus a whole lot of other indirect costs and lack of productivity, etc. And I always like to think of that number, 100. Let's call it, 120 billion pounds, in the context of the 22 billion black hole that the government talked about rather a lot when they came into government. It's a big number, and I think, if the government's realised that if we do something about that, then it can solve quite a lot of other challenges we've got in the economy at the moment. So, 4 fundamental drivers. At Bramble, we've got a fund that we're raising at the moment, but we also have an advisory business that works with corporates, policymakers, etc., helping them to understand and navigate the food system change that's coming. And a lot of that work is with food retailers, food manufacturers, the big food brands, etc. And a lot of that work right now is focused on the healthcare side and in particular GLP-1s. I think it's fair to say that at a board level, a lot of these organisations, it's taken them by surprise a little bit. It's not something they were talking about extensively a year ago, and it's now something that is absolutely a sort of boardroom topic. But pretty consistently, the questions we're getting are just help us understand where this is going, where it is today, and the implications of the food system, and therefore the implications on us as a business. And in truth, we don't know. I think there's a lot of opinion out there at the moment. Every day there is an article, or a series of articles talking about these drugs and how many people are going to be on them and the impact of the food system. So, and a lot of that opinion is not based on a huge degree of analytical rigor or data. I think what we are starting to see is really quite and this is the reason corporates are getting interested, is we are starting to see quite a significant uptake. And relative to statins or antidepressants is the other one I think that we compare it to as well. The uptake at this stage of the development of these drugs for obesity rather than diabetes is quicker than for statins or antidepressants previously and other similar drugs. So at the moment in the UK, we've got about 1.5 million people taking the drugs, of which 200,000 roughly are through the NHS. And I think probably the more interesting thing is we've got 1.3 million people paying £150 a month to take these drugs, which was never the case with statins and
any other drug.
Or any other drug. And I think that that really does show the level of demand that's out there at the moment. It's astounding, really. We think about many other things that are on the market today to do with nutrition. Zoe is a good example, a brand that many of you would have heard of. And it hasn't worked so well because the costs are too high and the value proposition isn't so clear. You're paying a lot of money for something that you don't get very tangible results from. This is different. People are prepared to pay £150 a month because they see and feel the results almost immediately. And so I think that in the UK that's why people are sitting up and taking note of it. There's a lot of comparisons to the US, structurally incredibly different markets. And so a lot of people say that the 16% of the US population's on these drugs now, we're at 6% of the UK, we're going to get to 16% pretty quickly. I'm not sure that's the case. Again, I think it's one of those unknowns. I think there's plenty of barriers that exist at the moment, particularly around cost, the indirect costs of these drugs through the NHS in particular, the cost of the drugs themselves, although that will come down. There's 3 drugs that are on the market today for treating obesity. There's about 150 in the pipeline at the moment, so across many different types, and particularly the oral administration of these drugs, I think, will be a lot cheaper, and we could see a sort of significant uptick in usage thereafter. But yeah, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of unknowns. When it comes, the other big area of uncertainty is what does this actually mean for diet? And again, you kind of need a bit of a crystal ball to try and work out the level of usage. And by usage, I don't just mean the number of people using them, but how often are they using them? Which drugs are they using? What's the efficacy of those drugs? Are they microdosing? Are they using them the whole time? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is going to flow into the long-term impact on the food system and the amount that people are eating. I think I'll just draw some early data that's coming out now, and food brands are beginning to refer to these drugs in earnings reports and the like. But it does suggest there's about between a 5 and 8% reduction in calories and grocery spend. And that is broadly across most categories, but slightly higher in calorie-dense, nutrient-light categories, so snacks and relatively unhealthy food. And there is early signs of a small increase in foods that are high in protein and nutrient-dense. So, I think the indicators are there that this is going to have a pretty profound impact across the food system. That all said, these companies behind the foods that we eat on a daily basis are incredibly innovative. They've had and dealt with many other trends like this in the past, and they'll continue to do so. And yes, for some it's a challenge, for some brands, for some categories it's a challenge, no doubt. But I'm sure there are pretty big opportunities that these companies are looking at, and they'll be innovating at pace. They already are innovating at pace and bringing out new products, and it'll be, I'm sure, a driver of some long-term M&A as well across the industry. I'll pause there. I could talk a lot, and I'm conscious I've got 3 other panelists, so but very happy to come back and answer any questions, unless you've got some now, Denise.
No, brilliant. I mean, Professor Adams, Jean, does sounds good, doesn't it? Does it sound as good as it sounds? How do you look at it from the perspective of health equity and others?
Okay, well, so I'm going to come up with some concerns, I'm afraid. So my name's Jean Adams. I'm a professor of diet and public health at the MRC Epidemiology Unit in Cambridge. So I originally trained in medicine, but never practiced, moved straight into public health research, and for the last 10 or 15 years I've been focusing on diet and public health. So my work explores how the environment in its widest sense, so I mean the digital, the social, and the fiscal, and the physical environment, how that influences what people eat, and how we can change those environments to support people to eat better. So a lot of our work has been evaluating national level policy to change what are called food environments. So we've done some work on the soft drinks industry levy, which is the UK soda tax, on calorie labelling on menus in restaurants, on supermarkets removing junk food from their checkouts, on restricting advertising for less healthy food, and on restricting where new takeaways can open, particularly around schools. So we know from all this work that issues around affordability, food prices, availability of food or different types of food, and marketing of food are all really important influences on what people eat. We know that less healthy food generally is cheaper and is particularly attractive if you're shopping on a tight budget. We know that people exposed to more takeaway food in their home neighbourhoods tend to eat more takeaway food. So if you live nearer to an outlet, you're more likely to eat that food. And those outlets are concentrated in less affluent neighbourhoods. We know that exposure to less healthy food can often prompt impulse purchases. So food at checkouts leads to you buying the chocolate at the checkout. But that removing it can help you reduce your purchasing. We know also that advertising acts as a prompt both to consume in the moment, but it also has an influence on preferences at both the brand and the category level. So what I find particularly interesting about this is like an advert for Cadbury's Dairy Milk makes you like Cadbury's Dairy Milk, but also just makes you like chocolate more. So our findings from our evaluative work tell us that changing these environmental influences can have small but important impacts on what people buy and consume. So individually they are quite small impacts, maybe a 2% shift in prevalence of obesity. But when you do lots of these things together, that can add up to something important. We live in a context in the UK where people don't have like really great detailed nutrition knowledge. It's hard to do that. Even nutrition scientists, as far as I can work out, don't always know answers to what I think are quite basic questions. But but mostly people have, you know, quite a good perspective on fruit and veg is good stuff, that sort of level. And in that context, we find that telling people what to eat doesn't make much difference. So our findings on, for instance, putting calories on menus was that it didn't lead to any change at all in what people consumed and bought. So that leads us to feel that the sorts of interventions we should be pushing more are less educational and informational and more changing these food environments. So all of this is work that focuses on prevention. Like, I'm interested in how we can stop people developing diet-related diseases at the moment, how we can stop people from developing those diseases in the first place. GLP-1s are a treatment, right, for when those diseases have developed. And they do seem very useful to those people who can access them and want to eat them. But my first concern, I guess, is that not everyone can access them. I'm really interested in the proportion of people who are accessing via the NHS. Like, it sounds like most people in this country are accessing GLP-1s at the moment privately, and that obviously leads to income-related inequalities. And I think there's also a possibility of inequalities more globally as well. We've done a really great job of exporting what are called Western unhealthy diets across the globe. And I'd be interested to know how well we're going to be exporting the treatment as well. My other concern, kind of related to that, is about shame and stigma. There is a lot of stigma associated with living in a larger body in terms of what social opportunities, employment opportunities are available to you. And it seems to me that GLP-1s create this very strange paradox of it's shameful both to live in a larger body and probably shameful to rely on a drug to help you reduce that weight, and that somehow we think it would be better if you tried to use your own self-discipline to lose weight. So there's all sorts of weird issues around shame that I would be interested to talk about how we can avoid them. And then my last major concern is my interest is in prevention, and I am concerned that there's a risk of a big distraction with GLP-1s that are so effective in treatment that takes our focus away from prevention. Within the NHS context, your prescription will last at most 2 years, and we find that when people stop taking the drug, there's weight regain, they're put right back into the environment that caused the weight gain in the first place. And it seems to me that if you want to capitalize on the benefit of these, you have to think of them as a short-term solution to allow us to sort out the environment. So help people lose the weight, then put them back in a healthy environment that stops them regaining it. So my one optimistic thing that I wanted to end on is one of the major barriers to delivering lots of the interventions that I've been talking about of creating healthy places where people can thrive is concerns around nanny state and government overreach. And it has occurred to me that as people start to notice that food noise reduces when they take GLP-1s, that might help kind of build the case for actually it is what's surrounding me that's creating the weight gain in the first place, and drive greater support for greater government intervention to create healthy places. Leave it there.
Great, thank you for reminding us, obviously, of the importance of, in general, choice architecture. Even the one I find interesting in the GLP-1s is that it changes the internal choice architecture, which is a good segue, actually, for Dimitrios, because you're going to tell us a bit more about the evidence of some of the shift, really, from a medical evidence perspective. Please take it.
Thank you, Bernice. Hi, everybody. I'm Dimitrios. I'm an associate professor here at Oxford. My work focuses on diet and obesity. I mostly do research on clinical trials, trying to see how we can help people with obesity or obesity-related diseases improve their behavior and get support to do so. So GLP-1s have been, as the previous speakers have said, and Ben specifically, extremely effective in helping people achieve weight loss, and have been much more effective than diets or weight loss behavioral programs that we have in the past. With the new medications that are in the pipeline, they are approaching even percentages of weight loss very close to weight loss surgery. So there is almost a direct comparison there. But the reality is that the data that we see from the clinical trials and the data that we see from the real world are quite different. So typically within a clinical trial of GLP-1s, people take the medications for a year or 2 years, but in the real world, we see that about 70% of people discontinue the drug within the first year or 2. And there are many reasons for that. The one is side effects. The other is that people have just felt that they have reached their target weight, so they don't feel that they need to take the drug anymore. And the third is that they don't want to keep paying the £150 a month. And this puts us in a very challenging situation because we have just finished a systematic review of the literature which actually shows that as soon as people stop the drug, their weight regain, they experience weight regain, and they go back to their baseline weight within the course of a year and a half. So they have spent a year and a half to lose 15 kilos, and then within the next year and a half, they return back to their baseline weight. And what this means is that all of their cardiometabolic benefit that they have achieved stops being there. From a food point of view, what this translates to is to approximately about 500 calories per individual per day in reduction in energy intake. And if we think of that within the course of the first 2 years, if somebody continues on the medication for 2 years within the NHS, it's a very transient change because then they actually increase their food intake by another 500 calories to go back to their baseline food intake for the next year and a half so that they reach their baseline weight. And at the population level, this seems to show that there isn't a very, very big change in calorie intake. So it might be that the effect on the food system is not as huge as we anticipated. But as Archie said, it's always a very big and exciting opportunity for the food industry to reformulate, to cater for this period that people are on the drug. The other important point is that within the research studies, we typically get people who are interested and willing to go on the drug. And we don't know that this is true of the general population. Now, there have been surveys that show that about almost 50% of the people who are being approached to take a GLP-1 in the general population are willing to give it a go, which is a reasonable proportion. But once you tell people about the possibility of weight regain after you stop the medication, this proportion only changes to about 14%. So actually, it might be that the effect that we will see at population level might not be as big. I guess the third point is about equity. And I just wanted to advance a little bit Jean's point that the people who are able to access it within the private sector at the moment are also the people who are generally typically very able to navigate the healthcare system much better, and therefore this disproportionately affects the people who are not able to access or might be most in need and must find it most helpful. And finally, on the weight stigma point, I think this is, there's been a lot of talk that GLP-1s might actually reduce weight stigma, but such a reduction in the weight of about 15 kilos doesn't actually take away the physical manifestations of obesity. So it is unlikely that the weight stigma will be, if you like, disappear due to the GLP-1s. And we also have quite a lot of evidence from other medications that if you take that, that doesn't actually change how people see you. Maybe I'll stop there. And
well,
yeah, we can come back.
Well, you've taken the rosy tint off. Now you can start. Well, I mean, I suppose the question is, given this uncertainty that we've heard from everybody, decisions still have to be made in the market. So it's definitely, maybe you can tell us a bit more about your views in terms of what that means in terms of investments as well.
Yes. Yes, so I'm Stephanie. I'm a researcher here at the Sustainable Finance Group. And we've been doing some thinking in our group about what the potential environmental implications might be of different uptake scenarios of the drugs. And there is very little research, a lot of speculation about what the potential impacts could be. There's a few bits and bobs of research that are starting to come out. But on this topic, it is quite important to distinguish between the difference between dietary reduction in calories and dietary composition. In theory, if everybody in the world who is currently over-consuming an average daily calorie requirement were to stop over-consuming, would there be environmental implications to that? Well, yes, overconsumption is quite large at the moment. These environmental impacts, though, would be mediated by what farmers might then transition to. It's not necessarily inherent that farmers would just stop producing food and turn their land back over to nature. They might start producing biofuels or cotton or any other type of agricultural output. But once we start looking at the topic of dietary composition, this is where more of the environmental nuances start to emerge. Most of the data that is starting to come out on how these drugs actually change composition show that most of the reductions occur through ultra-processed foods. And the science pointing to the environmental impacts of ultra-processed foods is still quite shaky. There are some early studies that show that if ultra-processed food consumption were to come down dramatically, there might be some beneficial implications for land use, potentially water and nitrogen pollution as well, since those are the majority of the environmental impacts associated with the production of starchy staples and corn and those types of grains that go into ultra-processed foods. However, we start talking about greenhouse gas emissions, then we would really be looking at animal agriculture. And at the moment, there's very little research that shows that this meaningfully shifts consumption of animal meat. Some early data that Ben has shows that beef consumption might come down slightly, but very little, and that actually many people are starting to transition to more lean forms of protein, such as poultry. And if consumption of those sources of protein start to increase, then there actually could be some environmental trade-offs that come with that via nitrogen pollution, still needing land for feed, and all of the associated impacts with that. So at the moment, I could see it is plausible, to use Ben's word, that if the uptake scenarios are quite dramatic and absolute consumption of calories comes down, there could be some beneficial implications, environmental implications. The real benefits to the environment would come from a change in dietary composition, particularly for greenhouse gases and beef. But at the moment, we would, in all of these scenarios, need some type of policy that would ensure that farmers are actually reducing agriculture if we wanted to give land back over to nature, that there weren't any spillover effects into other types of environmentally challenging foods. And as Jean alluded to, it is quite interesting, I think, to consider how a changing relationship with food that might emerge from these drugs, if it's reducing food noise, if it's changing kind of our diets and the way that we navigate the food environment, if what that then might mean is it actually kind of changes the political economy around trying to pass meaningful food policy that would actually ensure that the environmental potential of these drugs could be enacted. I'll stop there.
Brilliant.
I pick up on something that Stephanie said.
Yeah, of course. I was going to ask you, if you guys actually to respond a little bit, because I kind of felt that what we've heard a lot is indeed a lot of the potential for this drug. It's not a complete solution, as we've just heard now from everybody, but certainly could be a turnkey effect, it would seem to me. So I just wanted to sort of the first two of you, because I felt that you certainly brought to the table with some enthusiasm, having heard all the caveats. I was going to ask Ben and as well Archie as to sort of how do you feel about all these caveats?
So I think the caveats are really real. You know, a lot of these trends are in place, the social determinants of health. We've been underinvested in them. To the extent that we continue to be underinvested, that's definitely a bad thing on a systems level and all of that. And the question mark on maintenance is definitely a very open question. So now a lot of the people, they do go off. Some then go back on, they go on and off and this. But we don't know with oral, and we don't know how they go. At the moment, you sort of got the fast and early adopters coming through as well. Do you get this mass adoption for the people who don't want to go and visit the doctor, right? And that. So all of these are really open questions, which I think are quite interesting. Picking up on Stephanie's point, which you sort of raised, is then, you know, if you look globally, you know, you're seeing meat consumption, beef, pork, poultry, sort of going up and to the right. And certainly, from an investor point of view, we don't think that those long-term structural change, that this is enough to really change that. Maybe the slope might change a bit, but they're still pointing in one way from these big social, cultural determinants, which are really big. So that may or may not change. You know, I don't know if there'll be a big, if Trump tomorrow says he's going vegan, would that make all of MAGA go vegan? That could be a big change. I don't know, I'm making it up. So there's cultural change elements which could happen, which are obviously not within that, but presuming Trump does not go vegan and that all of that, then those are in place. But one thing I would pick up, which everyone sort of highlighted, is at a minimum, you do maybe have this 1 or 2 year gap or change, which is impacting kind of as of now, and is likely to impact for 2 to 10 years as it rolls through other geographies and things. And interestingly, one of the key things within the impact, so yeah, overall calories are down, but it's interesting that there's a consensus on the ultra-processed food bit, which is also the bit that no one really likes, is like, oh, that bit is disappearing off shopping baskets, but then it's forcing that the suppliers of that, because they want to make a profit, to think, okay, maybe we need to change. So suddenly this is where, and this is kind of the climate question, do you hit the demand side or do you hit the supply side? Well, if you've got essentially a demand shock where there's a load of people suddenly saying, like, we don't want cake and processed food, and then you get this opportunity to also reshape where you put your takeaways and all of that, and that's big enough that you go like, all right, I'm going to knock out my fast food line, but I want to grow, so I need something to replace that, and then start marketing on the replacement food. You have an opportunity to nudge that system with the political economies maybe sometimes coming on your side, this amazing thing that people want these drugs, like this is the first time that people are coming at. So maybe you've got this opportunity to nudge some of the social determinants with a product reformulation. You know, a lot of people talk about, you go back 60 or 80 years, we hadn't formulated, you know, the kind of processed foods that we have now. So you do have this opportunity, and investors are quite interesting and willing to fund that sort of innovation, because it's like, wow, if cakes and crisps are going to go off, what are you going to replace it? And there is talk from the corporate of that, whether you're as large as the Pepsis or the Unilevers of this world, they are responsive to what their consumer is saying. If the consumer in this year is like, oh, we're down 5%, even though there might be systematically this rebound, you can see in some of that, and particularly it's the more wealthy consumer, you know, the million on private, who are showing that suddenly they're not buying these ice creams and things. Well, we need something to replace that. What can we do? So I kind of think there's an interesting opportunity there. Plus then there's this kind of aphorism that, you know, what happens in 10 or 20 years is often very surprising, but you overestimate what can happen in a year. And so I do think there's some of these things like that silver lining optimistic, that you could get some positive feedback loops, that this kickstart in a way that in general we've had some of these negative feedback loops that that obesity gives you. And there are some people who do maintain, so although the majority are going back, we're trying to discover what it is about the people who don't go back, which are in the minority. There may be only 30%, but they're an interesting 30%. So some of them reduce enough weight that they kickstarted on the exercise that they always wanted to do, but they couldn't because they were that, or they're, you know, I've seen some case studies, you know, it allows them to get a dog, and suddenly they're walking a dog, and then you get this positive loop. Now, what can we nudge to get more positive loops and less negative loops, which are all of these tiny nudges together? We have this opportunity from it, is the kind of optimistic. Now, it might not, you know, we might not execute on it, but I kind of feel it's plausible. Anyway, with that, I'll hand on to Archie.
Well, I think that's a great segue as well to go back to maybe Jean and Dimitrios as well, actually, in terms of, I mean, if there is a turnkey flip in a moment, a pivot, let's just say, you could help change some of the choice environment. So if you think about the role of the private, and maybe I'll come back to you as well, Archie, on this, the role of the private and the public sector, well, even you know all what you know, there are moments to be capitalized. What is the best thing for those of you who understand the choice environment and understand behavioral shift? Because a lot of these are micro nudges, right? Ultimately, we're not in a place, you can't tell people what to do ultimately. So how do you create the choice environment in terms of nudges that could actually help turn that not just a 1 year opportunity into, you know, I like the idea that getting a dog is helpful. For example, that sort of, you know, Ozempic with a dog sounds to me like quite a human offer from my perspective. But anyway, so Jean and Demetrius want to come back to it as well, and Archie as well, obviously.
Well, I'm particularly interested in this. What do we make if we don't make ultra-processed foods so that there's still value? And whether that allows, if people are buying fewer calories, whether that allows them to spend a little bit more per calorie, keep their budget the same, and that allows them to buy higher quality food. I think there's something really quite exciting there of pushing food manufacturers to be creating higher quality, less processed food that suddenly people are able to afford because they're buying less.
Please, I was going to say, I feel like you might have come up with what I would call a win-win there. Please, Stephanie.
I mean, to build on that, Archie, you mentioned that companies are already starting to see, you said 5 to 8% drop in purchases at the grocery store. And the question that's outstanding for me is, they could come up with replacements, but it seems that there wouldn't even be a market for replacements if what is happening is not just a change in composition or desire for certain types of foods, but actually an absolute calorie reduction, then you just don't have a market for it anymore. So what would these companies that are premised on the quantities of like very low value foods actually be transitioning to? How does it change their business model?
I think we're a long way off that, in all honesty. And I don't think what you're talking about really there is the junk food cycle, which is the fact that, you know, I don't blame any individual for eating this food. I don't blame any individual business or CEO for producing the food, because we live in a capitalist world, and ultimately everyone is incentivized to produce, market, and sell this food. And these drugs alone aren't going to break that junk food cycle, I don't think. Not completely. I think at a principle level, I wish that we didn't have to rely on these drugs. I wish they weren't needed. But I can't really see a way to avoid them, because as one of the many, many tools in the armory to help address the challenges of the food system from a health perspective. And Jean, I completely agree with all of your points. I mean, I as I said, fundamentally, I wish we didn't need these, and I think there are many challenges, particularly around accessibility, and all of your points are completely valid. Certainly in the short term, I think some of those might be addressed. But yeah, I mean, Stephanie, I think you know these food companies will continue, for the time being, they're just going to continue to make the food they're making at the moment, because the market is still there, demand is still there. They're incredibly innovative. They're already beginning to innovate around some of these things. Nestle, a year ago, introduced a GLP-1 specific range, and many others are following suit. So, yeah, I think, you know, can these drugs and many other factors play a role in reducing or even breaking the junk food cycle to the point there isn't such demand for it, and therefore, you know, combined with regulation, combined with better food environment, more education of consumers, and therefore consumer pull as well. All of that could, and we hope will, combine to get to a point where these companies are more incentivized and can still generate more profit, but from better food, ultimately more nutrient dense, less calorie dense food. So that's the hope. I think it is a hope at the moment. And I think, you know, the other thing to say is we are, I would say, at or near peak hype around these drugs at the moment. And, you know, almost anything goes through a bit of a hype cycle. And I suspect with sort of, yeah, as I said, a peak hype at the moment. And let's fast forward even a year, and sort of it's very difficult to know whether that hype will still remain and how we'll be talking about these drugs then. Just to go the other way, though, and say, you know, a way that I could see them still being hyped even more in a year's time or 2 years' time is, I was talking to a leading scientist who's sort of all in on these drugs this week. And he said, look, I live in 2026, not 2025. And at that point, we won't be talking about appetite suppressants. We'll be talking about these things for all the other benefits they bring. And you know, Ben alluded to some of this earlier. There is some research going on around Alzheimer's, around cancer, reduction in the risk of cancer, cardiovascular disease, etc. And still very, very early days. But if that's all proven and the science is and we get to the point where there are more drugs coming down the pipeline and released to the market for many other benefits, then yeah, I think that's the point where you see a far greater proportion of the population using these drugs in some shape or form.
So there are many different pathways we're going to work through, obviously. So I would like to hear more from all of you. I mean, I thought that, if you're anything like me, you'll find this fascinating. So I'm thinking that we will have a lot of people in the audience who would like to chip in on this conversation, which we all have had. By the way, I now take a Tupperware with me when I'm having lunch with friends who are on Ozempic. Because they never, especially when you do dim sum, it's really annoying because they don't eat that share. So I know that my dinner and the next day is accounted for if I go out with them. So the food waste related implications as well is what I've been thinking. So shall I take some thoughts and questions from the floor? I've got one there, two there, three. So what I will do is, we'll try to identify who you want to answer your question. But I would, however, ask the panel, whoever wanted to jump in, eventually, please do, but so that we can at least help us focus. So maybe the person in the middle first, and then we work back up this way. Yeah, thank you. Please do introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sarah Herman. I work at the Children Investment Fund Foundation. I have a question, and sorry, this is fascinating, but it's a pretty new topic for me, so I'm sort of still wrapping my mind around things. But we talked a lot about health and those type of medication sort of impact on food system. But I also wanted to know if in your businesses or in your research, you were also factoring in the sort of aggravating effect of climate change around health, especially for, chronic autoimmune diseases like diabetes. Is this something that you sort of look into, or that you think, I don't really know how to say this, but basically, do you think that looking forward, you also estimate that medication like this can be more and more used because, first of all, more cases of autoimmune long-term diseases are, being registered right now, but also because extreme climate events might push more people to have a quicker access to those medicines because the condition gets worse. So I just wanted to check in as well, on the sort of feedback look. So we looked at health and then the impact on food system, but also just wanted to check on the climate change impact on health in general and how you factor this in your day-to-day work, if that makes sense.
Who wants to go take that?
I can take that, or I can try and take that. Short answer is yes, with very large uncertainty bars. We don't really know a lot of these causal things for saying with that. We definitely know climate, environment, there's a number of things which we think are having some impact, but you can't disentangle it and you can't do the experiment. But you can show that whatever's happening is the trend is likely to continue and is actually not getting better. And so in that sense, it is interacting with health and where will we see these things and uptake. And then the barriers that you reach are other barriers, which are actually kind of political economy, policy, batch aim or the other side, and all of these things, which then become more of your bottleneck. But we are kind of seeing this increase to use pharmaceuticals and that type of thing. So even though we've talked about this, in an ideal you wouldn't have this, in an ideal you'd have more prevention. A lot of those social determinants are we're stuck. They're quite hard to change, although we're trying. These environmental determinants also seem at the moment to be quite stuck. We're working against it, but those trends are in there, and they're interacting for sure with what we see, and they're interacting with political economy as well.
Well, that's right, but we're now having a medical solution to overconsumption, which in some societies is not allowed to be called out, right? In some societies, there's no such thing as overconsumption. You can only have a disease. So in some sense, it is therefore an interesting pivot in many ways.
Yeah, and so this will hit the cultural thing. I mean, there's this other anecdote. So these more fancy restaurants in New York and the like are finding, I don't know if you've ever been to America, and that people in Europe always complain about the portion sizes. they're finally coming in because actually so many people aren't going there and they're not eating anything. So it's like we're good at throwing out whole plates of food. They finally decided, well, we might as well adapt to what's happening. You know, that's tiny, and that's in the kind of, you know, rich person's kind of world within that. So, but we are seeing some of these impacts which will do something. And then you've got it on the other side is if we are having an impact on ultra-processed food, even if it's small and within that, maybe we are going to see some of these other second-order health benefits because we know that for unknown reasons, they've caused a lot of these other issues. So even if that diminishes by a couple of points on a population level, we might see some of these things. And it might be through actually these anti-inflammatory and these other pathways. Again, we're really unsure, but there are definitely these interactions coming about, which we find it quite hard to unpick.
Oh, let's take more questions, and others can come in as well. The gentleman in front, yep.
Yeah, thanks for the panel. My name is Sajeev. I'm from the FAIR Initiative. We work very exclusively on the animal protein side. I wasn't fully clear on what will happen to protein consumption with these drugs, in a sense that is that going to be moving more towards protein-dense products, or is that going to be plant-based proteins or poultry-based or beef? I mean, it'd be good to see because it has obviously climate and nature impacts, right, in terms of where we go. And again, I think now when we engage with investors and companies, I mean, we see sort of, you know, these regenerative practices and so on, which essentially means you have to reduce your protein, and then it's more expansive in terms of costs and productivity. But if the margins on some of these products then go down, which way are they going to go? Are they going to go the intensive way in terms of producing cheap meat, or are they going to go this expansive way of being like, oh, let's produce high quality regenerative meat? So all of these, I mean, a lot of questions, but all of these would have implications on the environmental aspects, also health aspects as well. So just curious to know your take on this drug and then what implications it'll have.
I mean, maybe Archie.
No, exactly. I was going to ask you, can you help me with some of the sort of what are the adjacent food and ag tech trends, let's just say, because alternative protein and others, they go, you know, and then maybe Stephanie come in on the...
You've got the...
Yeah, I think, I mean, I can certainly talk to the first bit of that in terms of protein. Well, I can to some degree. I think what the data suggests at the moment is there is minimum, but certainly positive increase in consumption in categories that are high in protein. It's not clear yet or how that breaks down between animal protein, plant-based protein, etc. There is some, but overall, dairy is up. Cottage cheese is one that's causing quite a lot of amusement. It's sort of back to the 70s, and suddenly everyone's eating cottage cheese again. But there are, yeah. So I think the early data that's out there at the moment from the US, looking at people that are on these drugs, shows a reduction, as I said earlier, in unhealthy categories, snacks and things like that, and a smaller, so not directly corresponding shift towards high protein categories as well. But it's just not clear yet as to where that is, and therefore the sort of longer term implications of that.
And it's definitely splitting cultural. So we've got really small and patchy data. So the real answer is we don't know. So we'd only have these tentative things, but there's these cultural elements which should shift. But the downtrend seems to be that, so in the ultra processed, and then a little bit in alcohol and sugary drinks as well. But where they're making it up on the other side is very unclear. So it does seem to be some proteins, but we don't know whether it's animal or vegetable. In some cultures, depending on what your baseline culture is, it's leaning that way. But to Jean's point, it may be leaning to broadly based higher quality is probably what you're thinking about. It also, when you put it in pounds, your shopping basket is, at the moment, actually, you're saving a little bit of money. You're saving maybe 5 to 10%. So if you're spending £100 or $100, it's coming down to 90. But you're not yet spending that extra money within food. You're kind of putting it in other respects. But I could imagine some, marketing person saying, okay, don't buy this cake, but swap it with this thing there. So but we don't know. But there probably is a possibility of nudging people there. So then you could say, well, if you're not, well, what sort of protein or more nutrient-dense food that you would have? And it probably is. It looks like it will be culturally specific as well.
Great. Dimitris, want to come in as well?
I would completely agree that we don't really have very good diet data in terms of people who take GLP-1, so we really don't know. But what we do know is that when people take the GLP-1 drugs by themselves, lose less weight, so they're less effective, so they eat essentially more than when they take it, and they have behavioral support on the side by a dietitian, a health coach, and so on. And this overall effect might actually be quite significant at a food system level, because we might be going from a 10% weight loss to a 15% weight loss, and then that might translate also towards the amount of period that they need to regain the weight. And the other thing that we also don't know is how we can best support people to keep that weight off after they decide to stop there. Because if they manage to keep the weight off, then actually that will have very, very big implications on the food system. And then the question is, who is going to, if the choice is to actually be on the drug forever, who is going to pay for that? Is it going to be the healthcare system or not?
Stephanie, because you mentioned that you thought that the evidence at the moment suggested that potentially we are getting more meat rather than less. Do you want to share more of your thoughts on that as well?
Yes, well, you raise a very interesting point about if this would potentially drive more intensification versus a transition to more high-value, extensive production. And at the moment, if consumption of proteins is to rise, especially with dairy, which is, that would tend to point towards these drugs potentially driving more intensification of certain parts of agriculture, unless money spent on the food basket was being freed up and then could be redirected towards more high-value products. But those kind of more extensive production systems are not necessarily always inherently more environmentally sustainable. They are for some and not for others. There are some trade-offs. The real impact would come if there's an absolute reduction in the consumption of it.
Great. We have another question here. Let's take that. And I'm noticing this side. Anyone on my left as well?
Maybe not so directly on GLP. Firstly, I'm a third-year BPE student here at Oxford. My question was on the environmental impact of high-calorie burning activities. And so people who are living these healthier lifestyles are also just, if you're doing it through exercise, you're also burning through calories. And so athletes have 3,000 calorie kind of or plus needs often. And I guess the first question is there any evidence that people are at large scale doing more exercise? Because definitely there seems to be more trend for, say, running and gym, especially that's something I see amongst my peers. And then is that ultimately, from an environmental perspective, desirable if we just burn through so much food, especially high protein food? So yeah, a slightly unconventional question, but.
Oh, I'm loving this left field question. Yes.
I would say, there's a difference, but the majority of people are not going to lower levels of like 3,000 to 4,000 calories. The majority of people, actually there's two categories of the first movers, but are super obese, not doing any exercise. Some of them even have difficulty kind of walking or doing that type of thing. That is the majority of the population. And then the other little bit of the population are those. I'll have a little anecdote. Those are actually having to use Botox-like products to deal with something which is nicknamed Ozempic face. So in New York, they'll talk about it, but they're, again, not taking 3,000 to 4,000. So in general, you're not seeing that substitution effect. Most athletes are not. And so when you're doing this, you're essentially not. If you can get exercise within it, that's great, but you're going to a kind of more normalized level rather than such a level that you're actually burning or eating more calories. But it is conflated at the moment, like in New York, loads of people who are taking it are not taking it really out of medical necessity. They've probably slightly lied on their medical forms in order to get the initial parts of the drug. This is the whole access point that we're talking about. So, and this is another reason that we don't know, because it's actually not going into the general population as you would have expected in your early adopters. And maybe I should have said, because in last year, in fact, even in this year, you actually very unusually have a supply problem. So the supply of the drugs can't actually meet the demand. So they had to restrict. In fact, they're still restricting access to these drugs globally, and even in places like you're meant to start on different starter doses and how the maintenance, all of that. They just couldn't produce enough for the amount of demand, and that's actually expected to go for quite some time. And then we sort of alluded to this. There's other issues about compounding or what dose you might need or microdosing. You'll have Indian makers coming through soon. It'll be interesting in Canada and Brazil next year when they go generic. That might have a really different impact because the cost goes down. So there's a lot of unknown, but it's probably not in that segment that you mentioned.
Can I
Yeah, please.
respond to that?
Of course. I was just trying to check whether anyone else wants to come in. I've got a question at the back as well. Please come in first.
So I think, to your question, it is, again, important to distinguish between absolute calorie consumption and dietary composition. Just like any positive environmental benefits from reduced calorie consumption might be mediated by actually what people are consuming, it would be the same in the other direction too, that not all 3,000 calorie diets are created equal in terms of their environmental impact. But your question gets to something that's potentially even more interesting, which is once we start linking environmental impacts directly to calorie consumption, then you're essentially saying that whoever eats the most is responsible for all of these bad environmental things that are happening. And actually, all of the research on the environmental impacts of food, 99% of it is on types of food and not just absolute calorie consumption. Because there are, so many, not all foods are created equal this way, and once you start getting into whoever eats the most, it's their fault, and we should kind of problematize that as a bit ethically tricky to start wading into. So that would be the point I would make.
Brilliant. At the back.
Hello, my name is Ludwika Zachasz. I work for the European Investment Fund. This topic is not part of my professional life, but I find it super interesting, so thank you very much. I have actually two questions. So the first question is to Jean. Considering the huge problem with obesity that is expected and the huge costs, I was wondering if you are aware of some pragmatic solutions that the public sector could undertake different than drugs that you saw maybe or could come in the future. And my second question to Dimitris, you have mentioned that some of the users of the drug, they went off the drug because of the side effects. So I would be curious to know what those side effects are. Thank you.
Jean?
Yeah, I can say something about the sorts of solutions that have been proposed and implemented. And maybe they do focus on things like affordability, availability, advertising. There's lots of soda taxes around the world which seem to have an impact. About a 10% tax leads to a 10% reduction in consumption, and there's been proposals to expand those to other less healthy food categories or to fat and salt, more generally sugar. So that's affordability. In terms of advertising and marketing, there's been lots of discussion about restricting marketing. In the UK, you might not notice it, but we do actually have some of the most strict restrictions on marketing on TV internationally. They're not very strict. There is a plan to expand those and expand them to online as well. Come the end of this year, this policy has been delayed like forever. Every time it's nearly going to happen, it gets delayed another couple of years, but we could do that. And I think you could think about advertising beyond TV and internet. So there's recent chat about masses of unhealthy food advertising in sport and sports sponsorship. There was a big paper in the BMJ last week. But you can also think about marketing more broadly in terms of restricting price promotions, restricting where we put less healthy food in shops and not prompting impulse purchases. There is a big movement in South America, particularly to label foods. So they use these big black octagons for a bunch of different nutrients. They say high in fat, high in sugar, high in salt. I think that some countries will have a artificial sweetener one, says not recommended for children. And they're pretty big. They take up quite a lot of the packaging. So the regulations say like it has to take up X% of the packaging. Starts to look quite like unattractive. And those are coupled with nothing child-friendly on the packaging. So no Tony the Tiger, no Honey Monster, all that stuff totally gone. And you can think more broadly about how we might restrict like just child-friendly impulse purchase marketing. And then, as I said, the other thing that people have talked about is changing where food outlets are, or in a way both to kind of shape our neighbourhoods, but to support more healthy outlets and fewer less healthy outlets. And so the current kind of focus in the UK is no new takeaways within a couple of 100 metres of a school, but you can think of all sorts of different ways that we can flex that sort of policy about location of outlets.
I like thinking that it's something quite simple. You know, don't push sugary drinks to children near them. Don't make them want them. But at the same time, it's really difficult, as Ben mentioned, the political economy of all these change making. It takes a lot. But also, even the retailers will, others will adjust in any event, right? Demetrius, want to answer the question about the side effects as well?
Yes. So the main side effects that people typically get are nausea and vomiting, and they happen to less than 10% of the people, so it's not a huge percentage. Most people manage to tolerate the drugs very well, but the ones who don't, then they prefer to stop. So, yeah.
I think, just to jump in on the side effects, as far as I'm aware, that isn't a drug that's ever been released for anything that doesn't have some sort of side effects for some people some of the time. I think you have to differentiate between acute and chronic side effects. I think you know, the side effects are talked about a lot in the media at the moment, often based on one person who had this particular side effect, and you know that they'll fall into the 10% category. You have to offset the side effects against the benefit at a population level of any given drug, and at the moment, everything we're seeing suggests that the side effects aren't that severe. They're not chronic. They absolutely are there for some people, and it will mean that some people come off these drugs because of them, of course. But I don't think, you know, I think we've said a lot. There's a lot today. We use the word uncertain. This is one I would suggest that we can be a little bit more certain on at the moment, is based on the drugs we're seeing. And let's not forget as well, these drugs they've only been around for obesity in the last couple of years, but they've been around, as Ben alluded to earlier. We've been using these drugs in some shape or form for diabetes for 20 years, and haven't seen really extensive side effects over that period. And if you talk to the scientists, again, they will refer to that, and they'll also refer to the way that these drugs are working in the biological pathways doesn't suggest there should be any cause for long-term chronic side effects. Now, of course, as more drugs come through the pipeline, there's always an opportunity for something else to happen. But I think everything we're seeing at the moment would suggest that the side effects shouldn't be a sort of really big fundamental hurdle that stops these drugs coming to market.
And initially, there was a lot of early scrutiny when it was still trialing, or this whole area of trialing, to make sure that there wasn't going to be any brain neuroscience, negative neuroscience effects. There've been other drugs which actually failed to get to the market, which go for a CB receptor agonist thing, but were shown to have these small but significant suicidal thoughts and things. So it was definitely in the mind of the science and the regulators that they didn't want to see any of those chronic effects going through. So they do look to be clean on that, except that every drug has risk score, like statins. A minority of people on statins will get muscle wasting or liver damage. So to Archie's point, no drug is risk-free.
I mean, a couple of years ago, I sort of looked into the sort of landscape of food and ag tech, and I was quite disappointed when I looked into it, because I thought that it's full of interesting things that would help with climate and others because of all the stuff around vertical agriculture, all the healthier stuff. But actually, the majority of the money goes into things like Deliveroo, food delivery services, and in terms of volume of investments. So I'm just sort of abusing the fact that I'm the chair asking the investors and others I mean, you know, now that we know what we know, that I've just learned so much from you all today about GLP receptors, and I'm going to learn the whole thing at some point. What is on the horizon? Well, now we know that we can fiddle with hormones, biochemically, interesting things could happen. I'm just curious in terms of where you think is next. In fact, all of you as well, because you're obviously in the area, please. But Ben?
So the question is, what next from an investment point of view?
Well, what have you learned from this bonanza at the moment that in terms of how the kind of toolkits or the kind of innovations that were coming on the horizon, that might have impact on what we're talking about, which is really food system shift and dietary change and other health, right?
So actually, I'll riff on one of Jean's comments, which is essentially that, I mean, you can put it over the blob of cultural change, but because they interact with small but significant social determinants, like your marketing, like where you put your takeaways, like the education that you've received, the type of the packaging, the way the science went from, 20, 30 years ago, there wasn't the same consensus around high sugar versus high sugar to now. You've got this complex web matrix on food systems such that you don't have one single thing which will change everything within that, and that you've got a lot of small nudges. But within that, this is definitely one of those nudges, and it's one of those nudges which is probably significant, in and itself with that. And so how that might interact with all the other nudges that we might know about makes that really interesting. So to the extent that you can do that, and maybe, falling into the other 3-4 pillars that Archie was talking about, policy, AI, and some of these other things, we're now at this moment where we maybe understand enough that we can put 2 or 3 of these things together and then actually significantly nudge that, to Jean's point, is individually they may be only making a 1% difference, but you establish 5 of them, and embed that, then you've got a 5% difference, which is suddenly really effective. So that's what I would say. I do think there is more money looking forward on the innovation front. So there are these we've been doing the same thing for quite a long time in a lot of these aspects, and now we're kind of like, maybe there is this space to do something a little bit different, this awareness, either on the frontier thing, because we've got, monitoring and the leading edge of where nutrition and things would go. That's only a very tiny piece of where it is, but where that leading edge can go, others might follow. And so we've got that. And then it might interact with some of the other things that we've got, like remote monitoring, which goes into our apps, which feed through to a doctor, so that you can then get really good nutrition advice. And then someone suggesting that maybe you can go for walks with your pet. All of those things are clustering together, but it's no one thing. But I think individually we're getting hold of some of those pieces, and the barriers for that are coming down to being able to do some of these things, and our knowledge is gaining up. So I do feel that we have got those sort of potentials. I'll end there.
I was just thinking that I can see Rowan Douglas in the room, and was wondering whether insurance has any thoughts on this as well, because that's an actually interesting angle from the insurance perspective about all the things that you've heard about health and.
Totally new domain, but I do think it's fascinating ultimately how this is going to impact on a set of risks, and it's going to reduce some, hopefully a lot, but will have wider effects. And insurance is there as a form of risk sharing, but also risk governance. And if we can bring the insurance sort of domain in here to help support the right effects and reduce the wrong ones, I think it could be very interesting. I must say, Bernice, I haven't really sort of thought this one through. I've come here to sort of tune into a new field, but would love to explore how it could play its part.
Yeah. Just on that one thing we thought about is from an employee perspective. So at the same time that at a country level, and national level, we have a productivity challenge, some of which is caused by diet, we increasingly think. A lot of employees have a productivity challenge through days off work and stuff like that. And I think you could see therefore a world where, and I think we're beginning to see a world actually where people are joining dots up and recognizing some of that productivity challenge, some of that days lost is through diet, and therefore it feeding into employee benefit schemes, either insurance funded or employee funded and everything else. So that's just a sort of an adjacent sector that I think could change as part of this. Just on the innovation front, pleasingly, despite all the hype around these drugs, we haven't yet seen a rapid grocery delivery sort of surge in investment activity. That was all. A lot of that was driven by one piece of research that a leading venture capitalist firm came up with, and a whole bunch of other venture VC firms got on the back of that and really, frankly, had FOMO and thought they were going to miss out, and drove just an extraordinary sum of money into a model that fundamentally isn't proven and still isn't proven today. So it can happen. It hasn't happened yet in this space. I hope it doesn't. I think two things I call out. One is just around product development, new products, new brands. I think there is just an enormous opportunity there for, the NPD, new product innovation, happens at an extraordinary pace around the world in food, and it's going to continue. And some of that will be driven by big companies, but a lot of it will be driven by smaller challenger brands as well. And there's an investment opportunity there. And the other one is probably more by hope than expectation. But one thing I would really love to see is what I refer to as democratized nutrition. And this isn't sort of really extensive dietary advice for people that are on very specific diets. It's more just everyone having access to pretty basic nutritional information. All the information's out there, but it's relatively complicated and relatively hard to access. And of course, you can go on the internet, but most people access it either through a device like this or the phone, or paying 150 quid an hour to go and see a nutritionist. And I think in the world of AI, we're not far away, I hope, from people being able to have access to all of that information on a free basis. So it's a slightly adjacent one, and it's linked to some of the things Ben was talking about. But I really hope there's something in there. There's some really cool innovation in that space.
Brilliant. Stephanie, Demetrius, and Jean, want to give us your final thoughts? Do you go first, Stephanie?
Okay. Well, I think what's so exciting about these drugs, as those of us who work in food and environmental policy are just kind of, exhausted of how little progress tends to get made on the policy front, that, we keep getting pointed back to consumer demand. But what's so exciting is that these drugs make it feel that systemic change is actually possible, that the desire for these drugs shows that people do actually, at scale, want to change their diets. And so if they're given the tools to do that, and I would echo what they've said about how amazing AI and large language models and very tailored nutrition advice, when paired with something like this, and then potentially opening the pathway to new policy opportunities, is much more exciting than anything that's really happening and tweaking around the edges of agricultural tech or feed additives or anything like that. That if this is the technology I've seen that has the most potential to create actually systemic change.
That's a good endorsement. Demetrius?
Yeah, I completely agree, and I would echo the previous speakers. From a pharmaceutical point of view, there is a big point of investment because there's a lot of new molecules being discovered as we speak, and a lot more enter clinical trials, and we even see drugs where about 30% of the people who take them lose about 30% of their body weight. So if these translate to actually going into the market and even having even more effective ones, then we are talking about a big transformation from a health point of view in terms of reducing diseases related to obesity, but also from the food system. So yeah, exciting times.
Great. Jean, final word.
Yeah, I don't have very much more to add to what's already been said about the potential for exciting positive feedback loops between individuals and their environment, between pharmaceuticals and policy interventions. And I guess I'm keen to understand how we can exploit that or make those happen, rather than the potential for we put all our energy into saying, right, we've solved this with drugs, and kind of we leave it there and say that's the long-term solution.
Brilliant. I think we couldn't have hoped for a better panel. I certainly learned a lot myself. Please join me. I mean, yes. It's not a feeling one gets often these days, but there's a little bit of hope despite all the challenges. Thank you for that. Thank you. I believe that we are finishing the proceedings, and drinks are on the horizon, which is also very exciting. Thank you.